Let me know when.
So good morning everyone, welcome to the Strategy and Operations meeting for Thursday the 3rd of September. Thanks to all the staff present this morning. We do have some attending via Zoom in terms of presentations as well. And I'm not aware of anyone from the public here today, but I thank you all for attending. I'm just going to move to item number 2 on the agenda, which is the Council Blessing. Good morning, Marilyn. It's good to see you here. And so, Council Blessing, Councillor Holbrook is going to read that out this morning.
Ia mātou e whiriwhiri ana I ngā take ke mua I a mātou aroaro. E pono ana mātou kakaha tonu ki te whakapu mahara huapai mō na hapori e mahine mātou. Me kaha hoki mātou katoa ki a whaihua, ki a tōtika ta mātou mahi, a ma te maia te tira whakamua me te hihiri ka taia te arahi I roto I te kotahitanga me te aroha.
Well done, thank you. Item number 3 on the agenda is apologies, and I have apologies from Councillor Elliott. And I think that is...
Mr Chair, I need to leave at 10:45.
Okay.
This morning, thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. So if we could have someone move those apologies. Councillor Hanford, seconded by Councillor McCann. Any further discussion? All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against? And that is carried. Moving on to item number 4, declarations of interest relating to items on the agenda. Just a quick look around the room. No one's brought any to my attention. You just need to check with Councillor McCann. He's asked me, and I'm pretty sure he doesn't need to, but declaring a conflict of interest around the Major Events Fund applications as he was on the panel. No, I didn't think so. And so with that, move on to item number 5, public speaking time. And again, I'm not aware, Tanika, just quick look, no one's speaking. And so we move on to item 6A, there is no responses. 6B, any leave of absence? No. Item 6C, matters of an urgent nature. Again, I've not been made aware of any. And so we'll move on to item number 7, which is the updates. And I think the first one is the residents' opinion survey. So Chris is just popping up and he's going to introduce that. And we've got someone sitting on Zoom, which I think is Alistair, who's going to assist Chris in the presentation. So over to you, Chris. Good morning.
Good morning, through you, Mr Chair. Yes, we do have Alistair Allen from Research First online there, ready to present the annual report, and I'll just give a brief introduction. He'll take us through the service performance measures as well as some interaction and perceptions of council measures. The service measures you may have already come across in our quarterly reporting, but Alistair will take you through all of that in a bit more detail, and be free to ask questions as we go along. The full report we'll make available on our website shortly after the meeting. And I have handouts here for the presentation in case it's a little difficult to read on the screen. So I'll hand these out and hand it over to Alistair from here. Yes.
Excellent, thanks very much. You're going to hand those out now, and then Alistair will take over. Just thinking in terms of taking questions via the virtual versus us being in the room. So there might just be a little bit of a delay. If you ask your question, we'll give Alistair an opportunity to respond, and we'll just see how it goes from there. So over to you, Alistair.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me and see me? Yes? Yes. Thanks, everybody. Ata Marie, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you so much for having me and for your time this morning. My name's Alistair Allen. As Chris has said, I'm a research manager at Research First, a research agency based in Christchurch, and I'm here to present some results from the annual residents survey. I'm just going to share my screen now while Chris is handing out those handouts. One moment, please. So that should be coming through now. Can everybody see that screen?
Yep, that's working fine.
Wonderful, thank you very much. So I'll just briefly go through the agenda. I'm going to first of all talk about some key findings. So what were the top line results and the things that everybody needs to know from the last year up to June 2020. And then go through the overall satisfaction and some of the drivers of that overall satisfaction with Council. I'll then move into a brief overview of individual services. The full report will have a lot more detail on each one of these. We don't have time for all of that this morning, but I'll touch on every service specifically. And then talk about perceptions of the Council and interactions with the Council. Before I do that, I think it behooves me, especially for some of the newer elected members and others who are perhaps not familiar with the survey, to talk a little bit about how it's done, so the methodology behind it. I'm happy to take questions about this now or at the end of the presentation, or really questions at any time through. There might be a bit of a delay, so please just shout at me and I will do my best to answer questions as they come. So this is what I'm presenting today is the cumulative result of the last 4 quarters of the Residents' Opinion Survey. So as many of you are aware, we run the survey each quarter. So in March, June, September and December. And we interview via phone at least 200 members of the public each quarter. So we have in total 824 completed interviews for the last year, going up to June 2020. As I said, it's a telephone survey. It's usually between 17 to 20 minutes long, and it's all residents of the Kapiti Coast District. So we contact them via both landlines and a mobile phone database. So we blend those together. The main source of our sample is our own database of resident phone numbers, and from time to time we top that up from other means, which I can talk about. We are very stringent in setting quotas based on the demographic profile of the district, and those were recently updated in line with the 2018 census. So when I say quotas, I mean a certain proportion of everybody that we interview each quarter, and therefore throughout the year, within the age bands, the gender profile, and the location of residents of the district. So that's important because when we're measuring public opinion, it's vital that we have a representative sample. Obviously, we can't interview everybody who lives in the district, but the people that we do interview as a body represent the entire resident population. I'll talk a little bit about reporting the results here as well. So I've talked about the sample of 824 respondents. Statistically speaking, that means that any of the results we see that include all of the sample have a maximum margin of error of 3.5% at the 95% confidence interval. So essentially any number that I showed today where we've interviewed everybody, we know that the true result would be somewhere within 3.5% above or below that number. And basically that's a long way of saying that you can have confidence in these results with that margin of error. And that's a pretty standard margin of error for surveying of this kind, in line with political polls and things like that. When we look at subsamples, so I'll talk a little bit about results by gender, by community board, different age groups. Obviously, the total sample size comes down, and that makes the overall, or those results, less precise than the overall amount. So we need to have a larger allowance for statistical error there. Furthermore, there's a couple of interesting things that are particular to the Kapiti Coast survey. So since 2018 to 19, we actually don't run the exact same questionnaire every quarter. It is largely the same. However, some non-core questions are only asked in particular quarters, so they might only be asked in 2 out of 4. Those are the ones that tend to not be related to KPIs. For those questions, the margin of error will be a little bit higher again because it's a lower sample size. In terms of looking at performance year on year, so I guess the benchmarking of results, the main benchmark we have is against what performance was in the past, as well as what the long-term plan KPIs are. So in terms of comparing results versus the past, we statistically test all of those results to say Are they statistically significant, or are they just a function of that statistical error? Where there is a statistically significant difference, those are marked in this presentation and in the final report with those arrows showing a statistically significant increase or decrease. Where that isn't present, that means that we can't read too much into those results in terms of variation because of the margin of error. And finally, as well as the overall score, where we ask people for their levels of satisfaction, and typically we present the total level of satisfaction as a percentage of everybody who responded. Specific for Kapiti Coast, we also present an adjusted satisfaction score or adjusted agreement score with a question. And this is done by removing anybody who said they don't know, so where their answer was I don't know, but also removing anybody who gave a neutral response. So the typical scale is a 5-point scale from, for example, very dissatisfied all the way through to very satisfied with neutral in the middle. The adjusted satisfaction score removes those neutral people and then recalculates the percentage of satisfied respondents as a percentage of satisfied or dissatisfied respondents. So that I am aware I covered quite a lot of ground there. Does anybody have any questions up front about any of those before I talk about the results?
Councillor Randall.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to the Speaker. You talked about significant increases in satisfaction in regards to conditions of road, right, which I've always been a strong supporter of, and public toilets. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Alistair, just before we go any further, happy to take Councillor Randall's question. I think it is relating to a later slide. Do you want to answer that now, or do you want to wait till we get to that slide?
If it's okay with everybody, I would like to wait until we get to that slide so we can look at those results in context with the other services.
So I'll just make a note of that, and I'll come to you straight away, Councillor Randall, when we get to that section. Is there any further questions up until now? Councillor Pravanov.
Thank you, Alistair. Just your very last comment, well, the last sentence it says the removal of these responses affects the robustness of the data. Does that improve it or decrease it?
Thank you for that question. To clarify, that decreases the robustness of the data by removing a proportion of the sample or the respondents. And in some cases, it can be quite a large proportion. So for some of the measures, it can be around 30% of people who give a neutral response, but that does vary based on the question being asked.
So it reduces the robustness because it reduces the number of people who are responding, is that correct?
That's right.
Thank you.
Just to follow up on that too, Alistair, from having sat through these several times, and not wanting to jump ahead in the report, that information is still provided to councillors though, so they can see both scores, correct?
That's correct, in the full report.
Thank you. I'll get you to move on to the next one.
Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry, we had just one further from Councillor Holbrook, I didn't see.
Yeah, sorry, I have sat through this before, but I can't remember, why do we do that adjusted satisfaction score if it decreases the robustness of the data and we have a satisfaction score anyway?
I might just ask if Chris wants to have a stab at that, because he's actually more familiar with the protocol. I've actually only been managing this survey for about 1 year, and it predates that.
No
Chris,
problem, Alistair, thanks. And it also predates me as well, but what I understand that we had a reasonably high number of neutral scores for certain measures, and it was difficult to see whether there was whether satisfaction was leaning either way. So what we did, we used adjusted scores, but we also take verbatim results from those who answered neutral on 3 or more questions, I think. So we have so we could dig into those a bit more. But the adjusted scores is where the target is sitting as well. So if we moved away from using adjusted scores, we would be shifting the targets, and it could be done, but it's also 50-50 either way, really, which direction we go.
Imagine it also as keeping the reporting consistent, but I'm just going to hand it over to Wayne.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely onto it. So, and it predates me, so Sean might have to speak. It was clearly an interesting decision point back in the day where for the reasons of the day they felt that taking the neutrals out gave you a clear steer as to who felt strongly enough one way or the other. That essentially caused us to need to be consistent. And so I, for one, certainly come in and said, I don't like that. I would prefer that you take the neutrals as meaning not that I don't have an opinion, but that in most cases I'm just sitting on a 3 out of 5 score. I'm neutral. I'm either really happy or unhappy. So we do a little bit of both now as a result to cater for both. In time, we will actively consider whether to drop the adjusted scores. But as Chris has pointed out, we need to do that at the right time so that in our LTP and our KPIs, we are clear what we're doing. As you clearly see, at the point that if we were to do that, our overall satisfaction scores will drop down by a number of points depending on the particular item, and so you need to be prepared for the fact that some people are going to just read that and go, oh look, it's plummeted. So you kind of dig this hole for yourself and you're going to go, is it worth bothering digging your way out, or shall we carry on? And at the moment we're carrying on, doing a bit of both.
Thanks, Wayne, that's very helpful. Councillor Pravanov.
Thank you. Is that better? Yes, thank you. So just as a follow-up comment to my question, wouldn't it be better to include the neutral responses and not the don't know? Because that actually, as the Chief Executive said, that's on the scale of the answers, whereas the don't knows aren't. And I think even though it might be an historical process that we've actually used, what we're actually really after here is what people actually feel, rather than actually being consistent with what has actually happened in the past. And I suppose, maybe there needs to be a note in there that says, we've changed the way that we record this, and there's been a change because we've done X and Y.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Could I suggest that we get through, take your point, Could I suggest that we get through the survey? Because I think by the time you get to the end of it, I would like to think that you actually do feel that you get the sense of what people think, because even though there is the adjusted scores, there is still the context behind that in terms of you still get all that information that shows the neutrals and so forth. But maybe at the end we can have a discussion around moving forward from there. So Alistair, back to you if you want to move on. Councillor Compton.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. I was wondering, just further to Wayne's point, do we have all that historical data that still has the neutrals in it? Because I know from my experience in the rural sector where we did similar surveying to this over 10 years, we had all those results data there, so you could effectively go back and rework it to put that data back in, so you could show what it was over that longer term, which would sort of address the concerns that the CEO has around if you suddenly change the way we're measuring it, you'd at least be able to demonstrate what those trends were over the longer term. Is that the case? Do we have that full data sitting somewhere in that Research First's archive somewhere?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, we do have it to a point. I think around 8 years of data. Yeah, we had another provider before Research First, beyond 3 years ago. But yes, we do have most of that. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to stress that it will have to be an LTP decision. So I appreciate your point is more about that we can show the context. And some people will choose to accept that, and some people will say you're just trying to spin it. But the key point I want to stress is that the conversation will be around LTP, because that's where we set the KPIs. We're not allowed to then go in an annual plan, I want to ignore that KPI. So bureaucracy, if you like, but it is going to be the right time to have that conversation.
Thank you. Now I'm having a quick scan around the room. I can't see any more. So Alistair, if you could just truck on, and then we'll just pause when you want to for questions again.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, thank you for all those points. I think they're all very valid, and it's a debate worth having, and perhaps we'll return at the end of the presentation. But I will truck on, if that's okay, and just give a brief overview of the key findings before we look at the numbers. The key findings are, first of all, overall satisfaction and adjusted satisfaction with council remains very high, and has increased year on year compared to the previous year, although that is not a statistically significant increase. It is trending upwards. The main drivers of satisfaction, and I'll talk a little bit later about how I've determined that, are the most visible and most highly used council facilities, those being the libraries and swimming pools, as well as the condition of outdoor spaces such as cycling, walking and bridle paths, and beach access points. Those also remain the highest rated services. Where we've seen significant increases, as one of the councillors pointed out earlier, has been in satisfaction with public toilets and in condition of roads and ease of movement around the district. So a few things to do with transport and roading, which is always a hot topic in all councils. And as far as the long-term plan targets, only 2 measures remain short of their long-term plan targets: street lighting, and not by very much either, and waste minimisation education, which is one that consistently has fallen below that long-term plan target, and is one of the ones that tends to attract, by the by, quite a lot of the don't know and the neutral responses as well.
Alice, did you want to take that question now around the roading and the toilets, or do they come up in another slide specifically around the scores for that one?
Thanks for the reminder. I think I'll take that question now because I don't have slides specifically for each of those services. They are in the full report with some of the verbatim comments that help to explain, but we don't have time for that today. Essentially, the increases in satisfaction are self-explanatory to a large extent. The increases in public toilets is due to perceived increases in their condition, so cleanliness, basically, and so I'm deriving that from the comments that are made, the verbatim comments where people explain the reason for their scores. And condition of roads and ease of movement is basically about a perceived increase in the availability of the road network in terms of less roadworks, or less frequent roadworks, and road condition as well. So when I say there's statistically significant increases, they are, and it's definite movement. But it's fair to say these are not, they're not massive jumps. They were already reasonably high in terms of awareness, and it's gone up a few percentage points. So it's something to be celebrated, but it's not, I wouldn't describe it as a step change. But certainly an evident result of effort that has been put in and public perception of that effort.
Thanks, Alistair. I'm just going to make a comment. I'm just going to give Councillor Randall an opportunity to see if he had anything further to add. For those that are new around the table, obviously we have these regularly throughout the triennium and previous council laws. We'll take that feedback on board, and as a result for toilets, we'd asked that there was more attention paid to the frequency and the attention around the cleaning of toilets. There was obviously a modest upgrade to the McLean Park toilets. I'm not saying that's a result of this, but generally you take note of the feedback through the surveys, and at the appropriate time do what we can. Sometimes it's an LTP discussion if you want to address something that's significant. Councillor Randall, did you want to add anything to your...
Two comments. Thank you, Mr. Chair. One is the roundabouts. Do you think roundabouts have improved the public's perception of roading? And number two, I have to, looking at this, pay a compliment to James Jefferson's team, because they appear to, have increased satisfaction among residents.
Thank you, Councillor Randall. In terms of your first question about roundabouts, the only answer I can give is I have no evidence either way. It's not something that has been salient in terms of the verbatim comments when people explain their answers. It's not something that's come up frequently. So it's quite possible, but I couldn't say. And I would absolutely endorse your compliment to that team, because as I said before, roading is important in all councils. We do a lot of work with councils all around the country. Roads are something that people use every day. They're very visible, and it is one of the highest contributors to satisfaction, or more frequently dissatisfaction with council, is the condition of the roads. So to see the results improving as a result of investment and effort, I think is something to be celebrated. Okay, happy to move on.
Buswell.
All right.
Thank you. I'm just wondering whether there is any, relationship between the poor result on street lighting and our overwhelming high use of our CWBs around the area, because streets are lit, and a lot of our cycleways, walkways, and bridleways are not so well lit. So I'm wondering if there was any comments from the survey around that, whether there's a relationship between those two.
Thank you, Councillor. I don't have an answer on that at the moment. It's something I'll need to go away and look into, which I'd be happy to do straight after this presentation. From my working memory, I really couldn't say one way or another. I would make the comment about street lighting that it is very seasonally dependent. So people are more satisfied with street lighting in the summer months and less satisfied with street lighting in the winter months, which makes when you think about it.
It's probably more of just a follow-up question, probably more for staff. Is there the risk that the feedback through the survey could be relating to a network that's not under our control? So I'm thinking of the shared pathways through M2PP, for example. Someone may put, poor lack of lighting, but we actually don't have responsibility or authority over that area. Is it?
It's quite possible, and we'll have a look at the verbatim comments to see if any of that comes through, and I can feedback on that. But the question is about street lighting rather than path lighting. But yeah, we'll see if there's any nuances in the responses. Sure.
Councillor Buswell.
I think that would be really useful, because we have, through our CWB advisory group, we've had feedback from youth in particular about the lighting of our CWBs and our stride and ride pathways, so it would be quite interesting. Thanks.
Just going to go to Sean.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So with regard to the street lighting, we do have areas across the district that where we know there are problems in terms of availability of street lighting. So it's an area where we've been focused on recently looking at doing some audits, and would be coming back to you through the LTP, possibly to look to increase the upgrades funding in that area to put in more street lighting. We're doing a little bit of work in Waka and within this year's budget to fix an area where there's a bit of a problem, but it is an issue. Certainly the Waikanae Beach area, lots of areas where historically you've had limited street lighting because of that whole sort of beach the way they've developed, wouldn't necessarily meet the current standards in terms of the amount of lighting you have out there. So this response, without having a look at the verbatims, I think we're aware there is an issue out there, so we're looking at rectifying that to some extent. With regard to the CWB issue, that would be a new one. I haven't had that feedback through infrastructure, but certainly we can have a look at that as well. But that one probably is a bit trickier in terms of the extent of how you might provide lighting to some of those areas. Is a bit more expensive than putting in new street lights where you've got existing networks to connect to.
Just going to go to the Chief Executive, and then we've got Councillor Pravanov.
In the last few years, of course, we've gone through the whole replacement with LED, and in some parts of the country it's been really interesting that there's been a heck of a lot of complaints that the lights are too bright. I'm not aware that we've had a lot of that in this district, and so I would argue that rollout went reasonably successfully here, but nonetheless it was a change, and so some change causes things. I feel a little hurt that the word poor was used. We didn't hit our KPI, but 83% against 85% still was a very high adjusted satisfaction level, and is I don't want to make this sound the wrong way, is technically within the margin of error of achieving 85%. So depending on your survey results over the year, you kind of almost hit it. Technically, we didn't. So we have to suck that up. But it's not like it plummeted to 75% and we've got a problem. So perhaps the word is not quite achieved rather than poor is all I was suggesting, that we do need to look at the why, and Sean's given you some things that could improve. And maybe if we see a lesser result from Waikanae residents when we get into the detail, that will reinforce that sort of message.
We also don't have a comparison, because if we've been rating below our KPIs over the last few years, we don't know how we've improved. Unless it's later on in the thing.
So it is, and actually we've been at 86, 85, 83.
In that order?
Yeah, over the last 3 years. So as I say, that's all more or less within the margin of error.
Yeah.
And hence, I don't see it as a significant decline. It hasn't been highlighted as one, but it is literally a fail against our KPI, and we must accept that.
Thanks, Wayne. Councillor Pravanov.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So, Alistair, I'm just picking up on a comment that you made earlier on in relation to you thought that the satisfaction results might vary with quarter. And I'm just wondering, I think that would be really quite important to look into, because I know certainly in the summer months people are out more, but then in the winter time, because I suppose lights are being used when it's dark, and whether it's about people being out and about more, I'd be interested, if you're able to provide later on a bit more information about that, if you're able to, please.
Okay. Chief Executives are saying it'll be in the detailed report.
Okay.
So, okay with that? If I'm just going to move on to...
Yes, I do actually have another comment, if I may, Mr. Chair.
Is it a comment or a question?
It's a question, actually, to in relation to Sean's comment. So you were saying that there were some issues in Waikanae Beach. Is that actually as a result of consumer survey comments, or is it more the fact that you see that there are gaps in the lighting situation there? Well, structurally, obviously, there's, maybe these, I don't know whether you have a formula for the number of lights over a street or whatever, whether it's not meeting those levels, or whether it's actually as a result of people complaining about poor lighting down at Waikanae Beach.
It's a combination of both of those. So there's a minimum standard in terms of the amount of lux, the amount of light that you are required to provide. The Waikanae area, we've also had a consultant looking at, I guess, the minimum standards that we're required to meet. So the reference there was Marae Lane. There's a couple of gaps there where we need to fill in with some new lights. The Waikanae Beach one was probably more about potential complaints, and some of that also relates to, I guess, an improved program of vegetation clearance as well, because that can often be part of the problem as well. So it's a combination of all three of those.
Thank you. I've got His Worship the Mayor, and then Alistair, I'm just going to come back to you around the how much more we've got left, just to get an idea of how we're tracking in terms of the report. Your Worship the Mayor.
Alistair, can you tell me, or can you drill down into the waste minimization education? You say consistently underperforming, and with a side question to the Chief Executive, haven't we taken some measures recently which may not have started to register? Thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship. I can speak a little bit more about the waste minimisation education, absolutely. Probably the most important thing there's two important pieces of context to give on waste minimisation education. The first is that only 22% of residents are actually aware of the service itself, and that's fairly consistent with previous years as well. The second thing to note is that 40% of people who gave a response about their satisfaction gave a neutral response as well. So that is, and obviously when we're talking about the adjusted satisfaction score, that takes those people out of there. So the score is real. there's nothing wrong with the metric there, but it is based off a very low base size when you consider the service awareness and you consider the removal of the neutral responses. So that margin of error that has come up recently is even more applicable for something like waste minimization services. The third thing I would add to that is that, taken from the verbatim responses to that question, a lot of respondents seem to be responding about waste services, so curbside collection services, rather than waste minimization education. So it does seem to be, for some of them, they are misinterpreting the purpose of the question. So all those things considered, I would say it's the least reliable of the service measures that we have. And I think that's contributing in some way to that underperformance, which we have seen in historical surveys as well.
Your Worship, did you have anything further to add? Just before you go, and to wrap it up into your response, is there a way that we can address that lack of clarity around the question? I appreciate from a surveying perspective we can't change the questions because it can change the outcomes, but could you provide more context? Could the caller provide more context? Or is it leading?
Chris can answer that, but it lengthens the survey, which is already at the long end. I think we probably genuinely need to have a discussion about are we asking the right question at the moment? Because we do know, and you've heard, that in particular a couple of years ago there was another bit of outrage about waste curbside collection, and yet when you look at the scores for curbside collection, they're very high satisfaction. So there's a perception on the one hand that the council should run it itself, but actually when we look at the satisfaction with collection, it's very high. So there's a contradiction in that, and big long conversation that Sean can get into about the costs of doing that. I guess I'll leave it with what we've seen with the verbatims over time is as many people saying, why on earth are you wasting money on this, educating us, as saying, I don't like the quality of the education information. I think as a council we have a strong drive to reduce waste to landfill, and that's what I guess this was trying to focus on. Go back to my starting comment. I think it's a good time for us to have a rethink about this question and let Chris and the team come back with something in future if they've got a recommendation.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I was going to add that I think it is legitimate to revisit the question, and then yes, it will affect consistency of results over time. But I think given what we've seen, and the paradoxical results we're seeing on the curbside collection score, it's probably worth rethinking the question. But there is a bit of preamble at the start of each question, explaining what it's about. So yeah, it's a problem.
Thanks, Chris. So, Councillor Hanford. So I just saw your name pop up.
Oh no, sorry. Just a question too, and a thought around the waste minimisation education aspect of things. Was there anything included around emissions reduction education, and was that potentially included as part of the kind of preamble to the survey in there, or is that potentially a separate thing that's been included in the discussion in any way, like encouraging our community to reduce their individual emissions?
Maybe Alistair can correct me, but I don't think there is. I think it is about waste minimisation in general, and probably the perception is that's about household waste rather than carbon emissions reduction. But,
that's correct. There's no mention of emissions reduction in that question.
Thank you. Alistair, look, just before we move on, I'm conscious that we're on page 7 of quite a large presentation pack. I do personally find this stuff invaluable in terms of understanding what the community thinks. I by no means want to rush through it, but in terms of your time and availability, how far are we tracking all right at this pace, or I don't know whether you've got another 10 minutes sort of to walk us through that, or whether there's another half an hour ahead of us.
Thank you. From my point of view, I'm available as long as you need me this morning. So there is no end time to my availability. I'm happy to try and get through what we have in the next 10 minutes. I'm happy to spend another half an hour or whatever it takes to make sure everyone's satisfied with the questions.
Thank you, Alistair. That might not have been the response we were looking for. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. So look, I'm going to try and take this through not at pace, but also I'm not going to just crawl through and we're here till lunchtime, so I'm going to try and walk that fine line. If you want to move on to the next bit you want to speak to, and if councillors, we just be precise with our questions and we can have a little bit of debate or comment towards the end, because we will be here till 12 o'clock looking at the size of the presentation. Over to you, Alistair.
Thank you. All right, moving to the next slide of the key findings there. So the main drivers of dissatisfaction, and remembering that overall the majority of residents are satisfied, but when it comes to dissatisfaction, the main drivers are not actually related to any of the specific services, or at least not the specific services that we asked about. Instead, so the main drivers of satisfaction, as I said, do relate to services, so libraries, swimming pools, outdoor areas, things like that. Where there is dissatisfaction, that dissatisfaction instead concerns a perceived lack of clarity of information and ease of participation in council decision making, or as I've said there, in the democratic process. Again, this is not everybody. This is what we hear from the people who are dissatisfied from council performance. So those are some measures where we have seen some significant declines year on year in the clarity of information provided by council, ease of participation in the process. And there are some indicative signs that particularly during the COVID-19 lockdown in the most recent quarter, so that was interviews done in June, reflecting back on that period, there were some deteriorations in people's perceptions of that. Another area of interest there is interaction with the council, or issue resolution is another way to think of it, remains a sticking point for some. So 19% of residents interact with the council in some way through contacting them or consents process or things like that, a complaint. The satisfaction with interactions is improving, but it remains one of the lowest rated attributes of the council. Satisfaction with being kept informed throughout the duration of the inquiry, so really about the constant communication and feedback as that progresses, and with the overall outcome continue to be the areas of highest dissatisfaction. Now, of course, there's going to be dissatisfaction when people don't receive the outcome that they want, and that's a really large part of this. So probably the thing to keep more in mind is around being kept informed of the progress of that inquiry. And I'm sure there'll be some questions on this slide, but I'll just cover the last point there if I can. We looked at demographic differences as we always do, and those are a feature of the report and of the dashboard. In general, there are few demographic differences by age, by gender, or by location. The ones that are there and are evident and consistent, I've pointed out. So younger residents tend to rate the council more positively, and I can tell you that's true of all councils everywhere. Older residents and ratepayers are much less likely to be satisfied with council performance. In terms of geographic differences, residents of Waikanae are less likely to be satisfied with libraries, and we've isolated there, that's basically due to the recent closure of the local branch. But they're more likely to be satisfied with roading. I can't tell you any more about why that is, but there is a higher satisfaction with condition of roads and ease of getting around. Otherwise, there are no real demographic differences to speak of.
Thanks, Alistair. Just got a question, I think it might be more for you, Wayne, or just generally staff. So looking at clarity of information, ease of participation, and the interaction with council, those sort of three topics, how do you see that reflecting with the organisational review? It sort of seems similar to some of the themes that have come through the year around the why, the rationale, the communication aspect. Any comment around, because taking into consideration that we are looking at addressing some of those points through the response to the org review?
Just to acknowledge that I think your comments, that it's consistent. The survey results are certainly not new. And we've talked over the last 2 or 3 years about the steps we take in those spaces to try and improve it. So yeah, just to acknowledge that it's well understood and something that we are working on as we can, and the org review does address that area as well.
Thanks, Wayne. His Worship the Mayor, and then I have Councillor Pravanov and then Councillor Hanford.
drill down into that question and see when it's identified as council, is that the governance side or the organization type side in terms of management, that dissatisfaction?
Thank you, Your Worship. I think it's fair to say it's a mixture of both. And looking at some of the verbatim comments around this area, there is, I suppose, confusion is the best way to describe it, about who is in charge. You know, there are comments there about the interactions between the executive branch and also the elected members, and again, this is not everybody, but people who mention this mention a lack of clarity about who is making decisions, and perhaps a disconnect between those two branches of the council.
Does the methodology of questioning elicit the ability of people to understand that the management and governance have different responsibilities? Or is that too complex for them?
I suppose in terms of our aim with the survey is to gauge public perception, not to educate or to correct people about the different functions of government. It's to understand what they feel, rightly or wrongly, whether they have the right idea or the wrong idea. You know, perception is reality in a very real way when it comes to resident perceptions. So we don't make any efforts to distinguish between, you know, who's responsible for what. And I imagine a lot of that comes from the media and from council communications, as well as, you know, peer feedback and things like that.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I just note, not going to refer you all to it to go there and all talk about it, because I've got other councillors waiting to ask questions, but the council perceptions is covered further on in the presentation with some verbatim comments as well. So it certainly does include a mix of perceptions, both with the organisation itself and the governance side as well. Councillor Pravanov and then Councillor Hanford.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Alistair, I've got a couple of questions, and my first one is just to ask, is the minimum age for people who have taken part in the survey 18?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. My second question is, I've just flipped over a couple of pages and I see that basically age groups are broken down into three categories, and the first part of that is are they the only three categories that have actually been used? And my second part to that too is, do you think that an 18-year-old is going to have quite different perceptions on the questions than what a 39-year-old would, because they're all lumped into the same group?
Thank you. Yes, you're correct that those are the age bands that we have used, and again, we're basically following historical precedent. I certainly accept that they are an approximation, as are, you know, the overall results of the survey are an approximation of resident perception. The purpose of the age bands is to look at where we see those differences. I would absolutely acknowledge a typical 18-year-old compared to a typical 39-year-old will have different perceptions and different awareness of council services. However, the purpose of the survey is not to isolate individuals, but to provide an overview of what the general public perception is. So it is possible to get more granular with the age bands. Those are the ones that we've looked at historically and have been asked to look at.
So if I may, Mr. Chair, a supplementary question. So I understand about the satisfaction, but also too, by actually potentially having some lower bands in the lower age groups, it might actually highlight some areas that might need some more work in.
There's potential. The problem you run into with granularity is a reduced sample size and therefore less robustness. So we need to maintain that representativeness of the district. So without knowing the exact numbers, let's say out of 200 people interviewed each quarter, probably only, I would say, less than 20 of those are in that age range, around 18 to early 20s, which would be the next place we would go, which is too small a sample size to determine anything about that group. So if we were to dial in on any particular group of residents, so micro-targeting by location, by age, anything like that, we would need to pump up the sample size, and that would then make the overall results non-representative. So these things are all possible, but there are trade-offs there, and increasing sample size, for example, means larger investment is required into the research to drill down on those things.
Thank you.
Thanks to Councillor Pravanov. Just before we move to Councillor Hanford, so again, a little bit of a history lesson. The survey used to be conducted differently. I think it was $400 per year, and for a fixed sort of fee, I think from memory around $30,000 to $40,000 to do that. So if you want to double the sample size, you're going to maybe not necessarily double the cost, but it does equal more investment, as Alistair has referred to. It's always the challenge. However, we did move to an approach where we do the aggregated 200 per quarter, 800 per year for around, I think, the same sort of investment. So it was a good move to get a larger sample size at no extra cost. But I guess to do that further would start increasing the cost of the survey to the council, with not necessarily any potential benefits unless you considerably increase the survey sample size. Councillor Hanford?
Just a question around the perceived lack of clarity of information. Did people give any indication of where they were expecting to get this clarity of information from? Was it from elected members? Was it through KCDC official channels? Was there any comment around who the public was expecting that from?
Thank you, Councillor. Again, I suppose the best answer to that question is it's a real mixed bag. People, when responding to that, and I would remind everybody that not everybody responds to the verbatim question. Not everybody is asked a verbatim question about the reason for their score, but when they did, there's a mixture of people referring to relating to a particular interaction, so a request or a complaint, a consent or something like that. So an individual, a customer service representative, as well as talking about the council generally through their communications. I don't recall any mentions of individuals by name or anything like that, but it's a mix of all the different touch points, I suppose, that the council plays in people's lives.
Don't see any further questions on the screen, so we're just going to move along, Alistair.
Thank you. So I suppose the rest of the presentation is really just a bit more detail on some of the things that we've discussed. So we might be able to move through this fairly quickly since we've covered a lot already. But just to reinforce some of the things we've talked about, here we see the overall satisfaction scores going back over the last, 7 years. So you can see the different bands in terms of the scale from very dissatisfied to very satisfied. As you can see, they're very consistent, especially over the last 5 years, and only 2% of people very dissatisfied with council performance. The number in the box, so the 80% for 2019 to 20 is the adjusted satisfaction score. So that's satisfied plus very satisfied as a proportion of those plus dissatisfied and plus very dissatisfied. And you can see quite clearly there that 1 in 3 people give a neutral response, which is not, I would agree, not the same as a I don't know. It's a neutral response.
No questions, Alistair, if you want to move along.
Great, thank you. So I thought I'd drill down into that a little bit as well to show by quarter. So remembering this is a lower sample size, so you get more variation. But you can see in Q2 and Q3, so that's December and March, you see a big jump in satisfaction scores, and then it recedes when you get back to Q4. When I say a big jump, they're not statistically significant jumps because of that lower sample size, but we do see this pattern. And if I move on one slide, you can see broadly that is a similar pattern that we've seen over previous years as well. so it's not unique to last year. That tells me that in those middle months, so the summer months, people are likely to be more satisfied. And that really could be all there is to it. It could be about seasonality and better weather. I've noted there the only service that follows that pattern is street lighting, which, as I said before, is almost certainly a seasonal pattern. There might be some other reasons to explain this trend as well, and it could be to do with the issuing of rates notices and rates increases. I don't have enough information to say if that is definitely the case, but could be something to look into.
Thanks, Alistair. Could you clarify if Q4 on page 11 of your presentation includes the COVID period?
That's correct, mostly. We interviewed in June, and we are asking people to reflect not specifically on the COVID period. We're asking people to reflect generally about council performance, as we always do. So it can only ever be an inference that responses are affected by the COVID period, because we didn't explicitly ask about that at all, except for one question which I'll cover later on about the council's response to COVID-19.
Thanks, Alistair. No questions, so if you move on.
Thank you. And here we see overall satisfaction by demographic subgroup. And again, just reinforcing what I've said before, overall very consistent pattern in terms of different groups, so genders, age bands, and location, with the main difference there being people aged in the younger bracket, 18 to 39, significantly more likely to be satisfied. And females generally more satisfied than males. Again, that is quite common across all councils.
No questions? No.
Great.
Next slide.
Thank you. So on your screen now, a little bit of a prologue here to some of the charts I'm about to show, which will be new to people, or those who haven't read the report. So this is something new that Chris and I have implemented in the last year, which is text analytics. So this refers to the processing of verbatim comments. In the past, this has been very manual and basically performed by Chris and his team, grouping comments into themes and deriving insights from there. That still happens, but it's obviously quite laborious and can be subjective as well. What we've done is we have a fairly simple tool that is artificial intelligence based, into which we feed all the verbatim comments that people give in response to the questions about why did you give that rating. Only the people who are very satisfied or very dissatisfied answer that question. And then the AI groups those into themes based on semantic processing, so the words that people use. And then we can quantify those themes, so look at the number of comments that circle around those themes. And what we can also do is analyze their impact on satisfaction ratings. So the engine looks for relationships between those themes and how they rate the council on overall performance, and in fact on all the measures throughout the survey. So what I'm going to present over the next couple of slides shows the relationship between those grouped themes of comments and the main objective, which is overall satisfaction with the survey. And this is the source of the insights I gave before about the drivers of satisfaction. So
thanks, Alistair. If you can go onto the slide.
Here we have a simple, it's actually a quadrant chart, but we're only looking at the top right-hand quadrant here. Moving left to right, you can see the bubbles represent the different themes, so the semantic groupings of different comments together. Moving left to right shows the impact of those themes on overall satisfaction. So where people talk about these topics, there is a higher calculated impact on the overall satisfaction, or another way to think about it is if these things were not delivered, the overall satisfaction score would decrease. So that's left to right. So on the right-hand side is obviously the biggest drivers of overall satisfaction. The y-axis there is the actual overall satisfaction score. So that's simply the average satisfaction with council amongst people who mentioned these things. So from that we can derive, if we look at those two biggest circles, so the size of the circles represents the number of comments or the frequency that these things are mentioned. And this is over the course of the year. 45 people specifically mention libraries. So it's in the question about libraries where we ask the reason for their satisfaction. And this is all about book range as well. So there's an example comment there. Got a huge variety of books and DVDs for the kids if we need them, and we'll get books in if they are not there. An online order catalogue is really good. So we don't force people to make comments. We don't ask everybody. It's entirely voluntary if they want to give a reason for their rating. And you know, these are people who were very satisfied with the library service and chose to add a bit more context about that. So I think it's important to remember that people are voluntarily giving this because I think we can interpret they are effusive with praise rather than we're dragging the answer out of them. And that's how we can determine that this is a big driver of satisfaction, because this is what people talk about more than any other topic, and it has the biggest impact on satisfaction.
Thanks, Alistair. I just want to pause here for a minute before we go through the rest of these quadrant charts. Does everyone understand what you're looking at in terms of interpreting the chart? If not, I'll ask Chris if he can just give us a quick pointer. Yes? Okay, no one's saying no. Cool. Alistair, if you want to move on.
Wonderful, thank you. So the next one down there is good range, and that actually has the highest number of comments, but it's a bit more general. So it's not just about libraries, though that does feature. It's also about swimming pools, cycle, walking, and bridle pathways. There's an example comment there, obviously, about the cycleway from Paikakariki to Whareroa mountain biking commuter network and mountain biking, which is great. So good range as a theme means people see a variety and they have options, and they appreciate having those options in all of those services and facilities. So these are, I suppose, the greatest causes to celebrate, because they instill this kind of spontaneous celebration of council performance.
Thanks, Alistair. Councillor Pravanov.
Sorry, I've got this question to ask. So basically, the range is from 1 to 5, and earlier on we had a conversation that all the ones who are neutral were taken out, which is 3. Mm-hmm. So when you actually look at the y-axis, there's a lot actually that aren't actually much above 3. So what that is probably meaning is that there's only, most people aren't, they're actually only really above that neutral figure. And if the neutral figure was included, it actually pull these down as well. Is that correct?
Just to clarify, and I should have said this before, these results here do not remove the neutral responses. Okay. So this includes responses, even if they gave a neutral rating, which is why the rating is lower than you might anticipate. So in the 3 range, because it includes the 1 in 3 people who give a rating of 3.
Okay, that helps immensely. Thank you.
Thanks, Alistair. I'm going to get you to move along.
There was only one more driver I wanted to talk about here. So you can see it's a lower number of comments, but this actually is the service area, or sorry, let me retract that, is the theme from verbatim comments, where the people who speak about these things have the highest overall satisfaction. So it doesn't have the highest impact on satisfaction, but people who answer it have the highest level of satisfaction. And that is about condition. So as per the example there, which is about swimming pools, clean, good condition, and modern, people also within that group talk about the condition of roads and parks and access points. So I suppose it is reflecting people's appreciation of the council's maintenance of facilities and areas that they use, and that is again something people celebrate.
Thanks, Alistair. I don't have any questions. I'll get you to move on to the next slide.
Thank you. So what I'm showing here is actually I suppose zooming out a little bit, so we looked at the top 5 with the largest impact over the last couple of slides. If we look at the top 10 themes with the largest impact, this is where we start to see some things with a negative impact. So within the top 10, and you can see the impact is, it is negative, but the number of people who mention these things is far fewer. So only 10 people in total mention something about resolution of issues, 9 people talking about spending money. And these are the themes that have the largest impact negatively on overall satisfaction. So the examples hit there, I guess, are fairly self-explanatory. And things I've mentioned before around issue resolution. So my inquiry that I gave, it was too slow to respond, things took forever, things like that. And then the second area there is about where the council invests money. And I'm sure I don't need to tell anybody in the room that that is where most people have an issue with councils anywhere is where that money is invested. So in a way, having that be the area that has the largest negative impact on satisfaction is entirely sensible, and if it was something else, that would be a problem. The fact that it is about council investment of resources, I would see as not a problem at all, given that there's only 9 people who mention that at all.
Thank you, Alistair. I note there that there's 19 comments in total in that negative area. How many comments in total were received, both positive, negative, or neutral, just to put it into context? Is it 19 out of 100, or?
That's an excellent question. I'm sorry, I don't have that figure to hand. The only extra context I can give right now is that these questions are only asked by people who gave an overall very satisfied or very dissatisfied with the particular service they're talking about, and not all of those people give a comment either. So it's not going to be a very high number. Certainly well short of 800. I'd have to get back to you with the total number of comments that were included.
That's fine. Thanks, Alistair. I'm just quickly looking around. I've got no other questions from elected members on that page, so if you can move along.
Right. So moving through the individual service results, and I do apologise for the, I guess, the very busy chart here. I suppose the purpose of having the very busy chart is to show all of the individual services as comparison to each other. So you can see it's been graded left to right in terms of the highest level of adjusted satisfaction down to the lowest level of adjusted satisfaction. And I suppose there's probably no surprises here, again, because I mentioned all of this at the key insight stage, but you can see swimming pools and libraries maintain their position as the top 2 rated services in terms of adjusted satisfaction. And those are obviously extremely high numbers and remain so. Even though satisfaction with libraries has decreased significantly over the last 2 years, it still remains an adjusted satisfaction score of 93%, which is very high and well above target. Sorry, excuse me. Moving through, you can see, again, some of the higher rating services there are about outdoor spaces, so pathways, access points to beaches, come in at 3 and 4. Community support, so community support services, very highly rated as well. Curbside collection, I think, came up as well. Again, extremely high adjusted satisfaction. And then you get one of the bigger movers, public toilets. So a significant increase from 82% to 88%. Water supply quality, steady. So I probably don't need to read through every one, but again, we can see the increases in ease of movement, condition of roads as you look around there, and some of the lower rating ones are around that. The idea of ease of participation and clarity of information, which I've mentioned, and value for money, which came through a little bit in the previous slide as well.
No questions here, Alistair, so if we can move to the next one.
Again, just bringing back the context of the long-term plan target, quite simply showing that all measures are above target apart from street lighting. I do take, I think it was Wayne's point earlier, that deficit is well within the margin of error as well, of 3.5%, but it is technically a fail. and waste minimisation education at 65 compared to a target of 75%. Everything else on par or above.
Thanks, Alistair. Next slide.
Okay. So some other slides here with a bit more information about council perception. As a general area, there's a few questions that go into this. So district development, residents were asked if they agree or disagree that district is developing in a way that takes into account its unique character and natural environment. And a good result there, once again, consistent with last year, a 77% adjusted satisfaction score, noting again 31% of people giving a neutral score, which is not included in that calculation. So very strong, very consistent.
No questions. Next slide.
Some other questions here about the district. So Kapiti Coast is a great place to live, extremely high endorsement there, which is wonderful. Clarity about what the council does, and confident Kapiti Coast is going in the right direction. Again, very consistent and strong results on those.
Next slide.
And then we've got 5 separate measures about satisfaction with council, and here's where we do see some movement here. Trust council to do the right thing, no concerns there, consistent. The council makes good decisions, consistent, although a lower score. Value for money is consistent with last year, which, that was a significant decline in 2019, so that there is no improvement this year, but consistent. The clarity of information and the ease of participation, as I've mentioned, is where we do see those significant declines.
Thanks, Alistair. Can we move along?
So we've already covered this, I suppose, a little bit earlier, but there's a few selected verbatim comments here. So these were hand selected. If anybody wants, obviously all the comments are available for people to look through. The main takeout here, as I said, is that there are no real major themes here. Everybody talked about their own issue or their own, I guess, pet peeve or cause to celebrate, rather than people focusing around particular things.
Thanks, Alistair. We've got Councillor McCann. Sorry to interrupt you.
Apologies. Sorry, James is driving this like a very fast car and I couldn't quite keep up. I just had one question about the previous slide. Is there any relevance to council trienniums as to when the public are happier with council performance or not happier? Is there any correlation at all?
I'm sorry, Councillor, I think I missed the key word in that sentence. Is there any reference to council training? Was that?
Triennium. So we are elected every 3 years, and I'm wondering whether the public are happier, perhaps, when a new council is elected or an old council is de-elected. Is there any relevance to that at all over a period of years? Is that ever... Just when you were elected. I realise there's a massive drop in confidence then, James, but...
I haven't seen any evidence that is a factor in these results. No, about the change about the elections or the election process or the change in the elected members.
Thank you.
All right, Councillor Pravanov.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Alistair, I just wanted to ask for seek clarification on these last couple of graphs that we've looked at. So here we've got the line here that says adjusted satisfaction, and when you go back to one of your earlier slides, it says that adjusted satisfaction is when the neutrals are removed. But I see in here, in these graphs, that those are included. So could you just explain how that works, please?
Certainly, and that's a very fair question. I suppose we're trying to achieve 2 things with one in this chart, and it's actually one chart overlaid on top of another for convenience. And that's our way of dealing with having 2 numbers to report, I suppose, for each measure. So the bar chart, or the stacked bar chart, quite clearly does include the neutrals. We've overlaid on top of that the adjusted satisfaction score which does not include those neutrals. It's purely for visual convenience, so we didn't have to toggle between different charts. But I hope that clarifies things.
Thank you.
All right, next slide, Alistair, and I think we're getting towards the end.
That's right. I just wanted to pause here in case anybody wanted to pick up on some of these things or comment on any of the verbatim comments here. It provides a little bit more clarity about what people are talking about when they say, when they have a negative comment or a dissatisfaction with the operations of the council. And there is quite a lot of different things, as I said, different people in the council, not one particular branch, and clearly some evidence of confusion or not knowing who's responsible.
There's no questions, but probably just more of a comment for me. If you look at maybe the first verbatim comment and the negatives, there's comments around wasting money, changing the name of the main road, everyone's time and money. For example, we didn't really have a choice. You could maybe argue the process, but it's something that we're required to do through the revocation. So I guess just really reminding elected members that you will just hear the raw verbatim comments from the public, and that's their perception. It doesn't always mean that it's right, but that's how they feel and that's what they think. And in some instances, we have to do it. And you'll see that on the next slide as well. There's an interesting one there too, which we'll comment on. So maybe you want to go to the next slide?
Certainly. So this was a specific question that was added in Q4, so interviewing in June, and that was asking residents specifically about the council services during the COVID-19 lockdown period. So it's less than 200 people responded to that. 200 was the total sample size. But when people did respond, they were mostly negative responses. There was a few, as in the first example, saying everything was exactly how I would have handled it. That's great. Mostly they were negative, as I said. You can see that the top one there around the fact that they announced a rates rise during it being COVID-19 was appalling. And quite a few comments there about just not present. So certainly some people felt essential services like recycling and rubbish collection not being delivered, council not being responsive, or I suppose beyond responsive as well, not being on the front foot, so not hearing the communication that they wanted to hear from the council, and the rates increase as well. So a few things that came through. Once again, we're highlighting the negative comments for the purposes of improvement. It's certainly not the case that everybody had something negative to say.
Thank you, Alistair. And then my last comment, I referred to the next page, and the one that I was referring to was scrapping the recycling as an example. Councillor Buswell.
I think that the negative comments are quite saddening to see, but we have quite a big reliance on our newspapers in terms of the communications in our district, with having a lot of elderly people still relying on newspapers, and of course through that period of time the newspapers weren't delivered. So I'm wondering if that connection and communication being lost had an impact on them.
Sorry, I'll answer the question. I assume it's directed at me. I think that's probably quite likely a causal factor, given what we see in a later slide about reliance on the newspaper as a primary means of communication and preference. So if that is the case, then that could only be a contributing factor.
All right, team, we've been going for an hour and 3/4 on this, so we've still got a few more slides left. Alistair, if you want to move along.
Certainly. So the last section here is about council interactions. So this is specifically when people made a request for a service or a complaint about a service in the past 12 months. You can see from the little donut chart at the top, only 19% of residents said that they had done so. So these are the results amongst these people. So amongst them, overall satisfaction, you can see, is quite high in terms of 51% satisfied or very satisfied. Here we don't have an adjusted score, so we've just got the raw scores there, so 51%. And that is an increase, albeit an insignificant one statistically, on previous years. but certainly heading in the right direction.
Just quick scan around the room. There's no questions, Alistair.
Great, thank you. There's a bit more detail on that as well. So the channels of interaction, you can see and who people contacted. 86% of people who contacted someone contacted a staff member. Far and away, that's the highest proportion. And mostly those interactions were over the phone. So 65% of contact over the phone, 23% in person, etc., 10% via email. And we've got the satisfaction by how they made contact there as well. So probably the one to note there, most of all, is phone, because that's where most of the contacts happen. And compared to last year, which is in the little box on the side, there's an increase in satisfaction with phone interactions, which is quite pleasing. A decrease, of course, in satisfaction with in-person, but that is, far fewer people in terms of how they made that contact. Council is improving in the areas which are most frequently used, i.e. where it matters most.
All right, no questions, Alistair. Next slide.
We ask quite a few follow-up questions in terms of that interaction. Once again, it's only of those 19% who had a specific interaction. The overall result here, as you can see from the chart, is everything is very stable year on year. We do see that, I suppose, the areas with the main dissatisfaction or lighter levels of satisfaction are around being kept informed about the progress of your inquiry. So only 37% satisfied with that. So very similar to the previous year, and only 49% satisfied with the total outcome, but once again, consistent with last year.
No questions? No.
Okay, so respondents were then asked to provide an example relating to the score they gave on being kept informed. So we asked this question because that has been a consistent one where the satisfaction is lowest with that notion of being kept informed through the progress of your inquiry. There's examples there that are both positive and negative, and the common theme across both of those is that having a timely resolution to whatever the issue is, and timely and frequent communication about the process of the resolution, there's no revolution, I hope, are important drivers of satisfaction. So people who are happy refer to those things. It was handled quickly and I was kept informed throughout the process. And people who are unhappy also mention those things.
No questions, councillors? No? All right, Alistair, we're moving along.
So moving along, so the last two slides here are around sources of information. And it's really just a bit of context around what the councillor brought up recently. So we asked people to name their main source of information about the council. It remains the newspaper or newspapers. So 49% said that's their main source. No real change year on year there. You do see a slight uptick on social media, but it's still, well behind newspapers and behind the council website itself in terms of their main source of information. I might just also move on, because it's a part of the same coin, to the preferred sources of information. And here we see a little bit of a difference, but still newspaper scores very strongly. But overall, the preference to hear about council is via direct communications, via the email newsletter, or via, I guess if you could put that together with direct mail from the council as well. So people do want to hear from the council directly as well as through the media.
Thank you. Councillor McCann.
Sorry, going back a little bit again, my speed is not up to scratch. With the interactions with council and the dissatisfaction among some of those, what percentage of those were considered OIA requests as opposed to just interactions with council?
Councillor, I really couldn't say, I'm afraid. It's not a question that we ask, and it's certainly not anything that is mentioned in the verbatim comments.
Thank you.
Just noting, and I'm not looking at the slide, but I think there was one verbatim comment about not responding or using the full 20 days, which I'm assuming is the OAA process. However, the expectation of staff to respond within 2 days I thought was a little bit unfair, given the work sometimes to provide those responses. Chris?
Through Mr. Chair, can I chip in and say that our average response time is around 11 days. So we do invoke the 20-day clause because we need to explain what the maximum time frame is, but the average response time is around 11.
Councillor Holbrook? Thanks, Chris.
Can I make a comment? Is that all right, just around these last two slides?
Sure.
So, thank you, Mr. Chair, through you. I note that the main sources of information, the email newsletter, is way down, and yet that would be what people would prefer. So I'd be interested to see how we can look into promoting our email newsletter a bit better so that we can align those two a bit. Would that be fair?
Yep, so Chris is nodding. Oh, Ms. McDougall.
Can I just add that we are soon to start, I think, an 8-week campaign focused on promoting the various ways that people can stay connected with council business, including our email newsletter.
Thank you. And look, just a comment from me to you, Alistair. It's interesting to note the page around being informed or being kept informed, yet here on this or the previous slide that you had, there's quite a high percentage of people that use no sources to receive their information. So it's a little bit ironic that people want to be kept well informed, but they use no forms of communication to be kept informed.
I suppose just on that, the being kept informed relates to a specific inquiry. So when they've actively gone out of their way to contact the council, usually about a particular issue, whereas the last two slides are about general information.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Did you have anything further to add? I think that slide that you were just previously on is the last of the presentation.
I suppose the only thing to add, apart from thanking everybody for their extended time today, is that, in my view, we run research for councils around the country, as I say, these are very strong results, and the areas that we have highlighted as relative weaknesses are very common, and I don't see anything here that gives me any alarm bells. So I think everybody can overall can celebrate a successful year of servicing the community.
Thanks, Alistair. I'm just going to give the Chief Executive an opportunity if he wants to. I haven't given him a heads up to speak to it, given it reflects the performance of the organisation, and then maybe His Worship the Mayor. So, Wayne, do you want to add anything?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, it's great to have an independent third party provide you some contextual observations, which I couldn't do. I think we are, over the years, we are pleased that where we've tried to put effort, we are seeing the results, because it comes back to what we're talking about a lot. You can't address everything, so you need to focus on what are the areas we need to. Clearly, there's one or two areas where the efforts that we have put in haven't worked yet. So still more work to do in some spaces, like keeping people informed. And one extra bit, there's some bits of work that we're trying to understand what people are interested in. And at the moment, it's quite small scale. It's not statistically significant, but it keeps coming back to me that most people in their busy lives don't care about what we are unless there's a reason to need to interact or a problem. And quite often what we get is, just don't bother me, I'm busy. But by the way, now that I want to know something, I'm actually not that conversant with how to navigate through. So that's quite a tricky thing, isn't it? That I think underlies all of this. How do we get people to look at the right sources of information? Is it the right information for them? So there's definitely work-ons there where we look to go, what do you want and how best can we interact with you? What do you want? And it's going to be different.
Thank you, Wayne. Guru, do you want to add anything as Mayor?
I think the key area for us is the communication side, in terms of the people knowing what the council is doing, and then the rationale that we give for the decisions that we make. But having said that, they don't obviously know the difference what council staff responsibilities are and what governance responsibilities. We are seen as one organisation, one body. So let's dance.
Thank you, Guru. So look, where to from here, Chris? I note there's no formal recommendation in the paper around noting the report. It's just been an update. I'm just quickly looking around. Doesn't seem to be any further questions from elected members. From my perspective, having seen a number of these, it is a very good result from the way that I read it. Obviously, there's still areas that we can work on, and I'd probably just remind elected members that when we come to an LTP discussion, if there is stuff in the LTP that has been requested to respond to this, then if we want to see improvements in this area, we need to acknowledge, we need to respond to that. So, Chris, do you want to add anything? And then we'll move probably to a break, actually, but I'll just check with Tanya before we do that.
Sure. No, there was no recommendation I thought needed. The report is as it is. The full report adds a bit more appendices to these slides, and we'll make that available on the website. And I think there's also a press release being drafted in association with it. That's all.
Thanks, Chris. And Alistair, thank you very much for your time this morning and walking us through that report.
Thank you, everybody, for your time. Ngā mihi nui.
Elected members, we head up next the community contract report backs. And Tanya, I appreciate that the team had been waiting a long time to present to that. Would it be preferable that we bring them in now, or would you rather the elected members take a break and then, I'm not too sure whether they're just waiting in the foyer? Okay, so look, team, we're going to break for 10 minutes, back at 11:10, where we're going to hear from the community contracts report backs. So it's 11:10.